All right, welcome everybody. I'm so glad that you could join us today for our discussion on why every leader needs strategic thinking skills and not just executives. Now, for those of you who I haven't met yet, my name's Scott Arietta. I'm the founder and the CEO of Unity and Company. Now, before I started Unity, I spent years as an operations and HR executive in high growth venture backed companies. And these are places where leaders are constantly challenged to think strategically while also delivering results in a fast moving and complex environment. And I've seen firsthand how leaders can thrive when they understand how to connect the dots and how they can struggle when they don't have the tools to think beyond the day to day. And so at Unity and Company, we specialize in leadership development, team effectiveness, and culture transformation. And our work focuses on helping leaders to build the capabilities that matter most for long-term organizational success. And one of those core capabilities is strategic thinking. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. Okay, now let's set the stage. One of the most common pieces of feedback that leaders receive as they rise in their careers is something like, you need to be more strategic. It's practically a rite of passage. The problem is, it's also one of the least clearly defined expectations in the business environment. Leaders are told to be strategic, but rarely are they given a definition, a framework, or a roadmap for how exactly to do that. In fact, research from the Center for Creative Leadership shows that 67% of managers have received this feedback. But the vast majority say that they've never been told what it means or how to even build the skill. And that's the gap that we're here to close today. Because most people associate strategy with executives, CEOs and boardrooms making long-term plans. But the truth is, every leader at every level needs strategic thinking skills. Without them, managers get stuck in firefighting mode. Teams lose sight of the big picture. Organizations miss opportunities. And with them, leaders align their teams, anticipate challenges, and make decisions that create real impact. And here's where we're headed in this session. We're going to define what strategic thinking really means, and we're going to use respected research and practical frameworks to do that. Then we'll break down its core components, including systems thinking and what makes good strategy. And then we'll explore why every leader, not just executives, need this skill set. And finally, we'll show that strategic thinking is a learnable discipline, one that your organization can and must intentionally develop. So by the end, I want you to walk away convinced that strategic thinking is not optional. It's not reserved for the C-suite, and it's not impossible to teach. It's a skill that unlocks better decisions, stronger alignment, and greater organizational resilience. All right, so let's dig deeper into that feedback that so many leaders hear, that you're not strategic enough. Now, if you've ever received that comment or if you've had to give it to somebody else, then you know how frustrating it can be. I mean, it's one of the most common critiques that leaders get as they move into management, but it's also one of the most unhelpful. So why is this? It's because it's rarely defined. I mean, leaders walk away with no clearer understanding of what to do differently. It's the leadership equivalent of telling like a basketball player, just score more points. Okay, sure, but how? Do you want them to improve their free throws? Do you want them to work on passing? Do you want them to build endurance? I mean, without clarity, the advice is demoralizing and paralyzing instead of helpful. And research actually backs this up. So the Center for Creative Leadership found that 60% of managers have never received formal training in strategy. And at the same time, 67% report that they've been told to be more strategic. So in other words, leaders are told what's missing, but they're not taught how to fill the gap. And Bain and Company adds another perspective. In their global leadership survey, they found that 80% of executives said that their managers struggle to connect daily work to the company's overall strategy. And that disconnect creates frustration on both sides. I mean, executives feel that their teams just don't get it, and managers feel like they're being asked to deliver results without being given the tools or the context to do so. And here's the kicker. Even when organizations do have a strategy, it often fails to filter down clearly. So Donald Sull, writing in the MIT Sloan Management Review, said, quote, most organizations don't fail for lack of strategy. They fail for lack of execution. And execution fails because people don't understand the strategy. And this is the trap that we're talking about. Leaders hear that they're not strategic enough, but they're not given a shared definition of strategy, a framework for how to think strategically, or coaching on how to practice it. We're just setting them up to fail. And when leaders are left in that trap, three big consequences show up. So leaders default to the tactical. So without guidance, most managers stick to what they know, which is problem solving, task management, short-term execution. They get caught in the weeds. And then teams lose sight of the big picture. And if managers can't connect the dots between daily tasks and organizational priorities, employees lose motivation. Work feels transactional instead of purposeful. And then executives lose confidence in their pipeline. I mean, if middle managers can't think strategically, senior leaders worry that they don't have the bench strength to grow into future executive roles. So the phrase not strategic enough becomes a career limiter. I mean, leaders feel stuck. They're unsure of how to demonstrate growth in this competency. And then teams stagnate because they're led by managers who are excellent executors but poor connectors. And then organizations suffer because the gap between strategy and execution just never closes. And so here's the good news, though. I mean, it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, once we move beyond vague feedback and actually define strategic thinking, we can give leaders the tools that they need in order to grow. And that's where we're headed next. We're going to break down what strategic thinking really is, using research from respected scholars like Liedtka, Richard Rumelt, and Henry Mintzberg. And by the end, you'll see that be more strategic doesn't have to be a vague critique. It can be a clear and teachable and actionable skill set. All right, so now that we've identified the trap that leaders fall into when they're told to be more strategic, let's get specific here. What does strategic thinking actually mean? And this is where research is incredibly helpful. So one of the clearest frameworks comes from Liedtka at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. And in her influential paper, Strategic Thinking, Can It Be Taught?, she describes 5 key dimensions that define this skill. So the first is systems perspective. This is the ability to see the organization as an interconnected whole, not just as silos or individual projects. The next is intent focus, which is a clear orientation towards long-term goals, even when dealing with short-term pressures. Next up is thinking in time, the ability to connect past, present, and future. You're learning from history while planning for what's next. The next is hypothesis-driven, or being hypothesis-driven, which is all about testing assumptions and exploring options with a scientific mindset rather than jumping immediately to conclusions. And then there's intelligent opportunism, which is the flexibility to recognize and seize new opportunities when they arise without losing sight of the bigger vision. Now, when you put these dimensions together, you see that strategic thinking isn't just about planning ahead or thinking big. It's about holding multiple perspectives at once. It's about balancing focus and flexibility, learning and acting, execution and adaptation. Another respected voice in this space is Richard Rumelt, who's a professor at UCLA, and he's the author of Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And he writes in his book, the core of strategy is discovering the critical factors in a situation and designing a way of coordinating and focusing actions in order to deal with them. So in other words, strategy isn't about grand statements or lofty visions. It's about identifying what really matters in a given context, making clear choices, and then aligning actions accordingly. So Rumelt's work reminds us that strategy is all about focus, saying no to good ideas so that you can concentrate on the essential ones. And Henry Mintzberg, one of the most cited scholars in management, he gives us yet another angle. He defines strategy as a pattern in a stream of decisions. And what Mintzberg is saying here is powerful. Strategy is not just the plan written in a deck. It's the lived pattern of choices that an organization makes over time. The strategy you say you have matters less than the strategy your decisions reveal. So taken together, these definitions give us a practical way to think about strategic thinking as a leadership competency. It's not about having the title of executive. It's not about being the loudest voice in the room. It's not about having the longest term vision. Instead, strategic thinking is about developing the mindset and the skill set to see the whole system and how the parts connect, to anchor decisions in intent and purpose, to learn from the past, act in the present and anticipate the future, and to test assumptions and adapt as you go, to spot opportunities without losing focus on the bigger picture. So the next time a leader hears you need to be more strategic, instead of walking away confused, they could instead ask themselves, am I demonstrating systems perspective? Am I showing intent focus? Am I connecting the dots across time? Am I testing my assumptions? Am I flexible enough to seize opportunities without losing direction? That's the practical shift that we want to create. We want to go from vague critique to clear, actionable dimensions. And here's the key message to underline. Strategic thinking is not mystical, and it's not reserved for executives. It's a discipline that can be learned. Cynthia Montgomery of Harvard Business School put it plainly in her book called The Strategist. She said exactly that. So by grounding the concept in research and practice, we move from ambiguity to clarity, and we give leaders a roadmap for growth. Okay, so now that we've defined strategic thinking, let's go deeper into the components that make it work in practice. So Liedtka's framework gives us the 5 dimensions, and I want to unpack those here because they form the backbone of what we mean when we say to be more strategic. So let's talk about systems thinking. Strategic thinkers, they don't look at problems in isolation. They zoom out. They ask, how does this piece fit into the bigger puzzle? And this is what Peter Senge, who's the author of The Fifth Discipline, called seeing holes. Now, without systems perspective, leaders risk creating short-term fixes that actually make the long-term problem worse. What Donella Meadows in Thinking in Systems referred to as fixes that fail. A simple example, so cutting training budgets to save money in the short run only to face high turnover and weaker performance down the line. Strategic thinkers recognize those dynamics before they become crises. Next up is intent focus. So Liedtka describes this as keeping a clear line of sight on long-term objectives while navigating the noise of day-to-day work. So intent focus means anchoring decisions in purpose. So Richard Rumelt echoes this. He said that strategy is about making clear choices in service of the most critical goals. And without intent focus, leaders end up chasing every shiny object. They're spreading resources too thin, confusing their teams, and they dilute their impact. All right, next up is thinking in time. So thinking in time is the ability to link past and future. Strategic leaders ask, what can we learn from what's already happened? How does that shape today's choices? And how will today's actions shape tomorrow's outcomes? This dimension builds what some scholars call temporal intelligence. So leaders who think in time avoid repeating mistakes. They learn from their patterns. They prepare their teams for what's coming rather than just reacting to what's already here. All right, so the next up is hypothesis-driven thinking. So this is about testing assumptions. So Daniel Kahneman, who was a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist and author of Thinking Fast and Slow, he warned us, quote, "We are blind to the obvious, and we are blind to our blindness." Now, strategic thinkers counteract this blindness by treating decisions like experiments. They form hypotheses, they test them, they adapt. So for example, instead of betting everything on one unproven idea, they run pilots, they gather data, and they iterate. Next up is intelligent opportunism. So finally, strategic thinkers are flexible. They don't cling rigidly to a plan when new information emerges. They stay open to opportunities that align with their intent, even if those opportunities weren't part of the original roadmap. So this is what allows organizations to pivot effectively when conditions change. So think of companies that successfully shifted during the pandemic. They weren't just lucky, they were prepared to recognize and act on new possibilities quickly. Now, here's the critical point. These aren't abstract traits. They're practical behaviors that leaders can practice. Systems perspective shows up when a manager asks, how will this decision impact other departments? Intent focus shows up when a leader says no to a good idea because it distracts from the best idea. Thinking in time shows up when a team reflects on past projects before starting a new one. And hypothesis-driven thinking shows up when a leader pilots an approach rather than rolling it out blindly. Intelligent opportunism shows up when a team quickly adapts to seize a new client opportunity that wasn't in the original plan. And here's why this matters, because according to the Center for Creative Leadership, leaders who demonstrate strong strategic thinking competencies are rated 10 times more effective overall than peers who don't. That's not a small gap. It's an order of magnitude. It's a career defining difference. So when we talk about developing strategic thinking, it's not about vague, big picture skills. It's about teaching leaders how to practice these 5 dimensions consistently. And when they do, their teams execute better, their decisions improve, and their credibility skyrockets. Okay, so if there's one discipline that underpins strategic thinking more than any other, it's systems thinking. So Peter Senge, in his landmark book, The Fifth Discipline, describes systems thinking as, quote, a discipline for seeing wholes, end quote. And what he means by that is that in complex organizations, nothing exists in isolation. Every decision, every process, every outcome is a part of a larger web of interconnections. So leaders who don't understand those interconnections risk solving the wrong problem, or worse, they create bigger problems down the line. So you can think of it this way. Imagine a hospital that's struggling with long patient wait times in the emergency department. A non-strategic leader might look only at the ER and decide to add more nurses. That seems logical, but it might not solve the problem if the real bottleneck is in radiology, where scans are taking too long, or in inpatient wards where patients aren't being discharged quickly enough to make room for new admissions. So without seeing this whole system, leaders chase symptoms instead of root causes. And Donella Meadows, another giant in the field, put it this way in her book, Thinking in Systems. She said, quote, a system is more than the sum of its parts. It may exhibit adaptive, dynamic, goal-seeking, self-preserving, and evolutionary behavior. So what that means is that organizations aren't just machines where you can pull one lever and get a predictable result. They're living systems with feedback loops. Sometimes an action produces the opposite of the intended outcome. And this is what Meadows calls policy resistance. For example, offering overtime pay to speed up production may lead to employee burnout, absenteeism, and eventually even slower output. And this is why McKinsey has reported that 70% of organizational change initiatives fail, often because leaders approach them with linear, short-term fixes instead of systems-based thinking. So, what does this mean for leaders? Systems thinking requires a few practical shifts in perspective. You need to look for interconnection. So instead of asking what's happening in my department, you need to ask, how does what's happening here connect to what's happening elsewhere? You need to pay attention to feedback loops. I mean, outcomes don't just happen once, they ripple back into the system. High turnover, for example, can lead to increased workloads for remaining staff, which creates even more turnover. You need to seek leverage points. So as Meadows observed, small changes in the right places can create disproportionately large impacts. Strategic leaders know how to find those leverage points instead of pushing harder in areas where there's little return. And then you need to think long term because systems often react with delays. I mean, leaders who expect instant results miss the bigger picture. Strategic leaders recognize when patience is part of the strategy. Now, here's why this matters, because when leaders develop systems thinking, they avoid the trap of firefighting. They stop chasing quick fixes and they start addressing root causes. They create solutions that last. And perhaps most importantly, they empower their teams to see beyond silos and connect their work to a bigger purpose. So in practice, this doesn't mean that every leader needs to become a systems theorist. I mean, it means that they do need to cultivate the habit of zooming out, asking different questions, and considering unintended consequences before taking action. Strategic thinking without systems thinking is incomplete. Together, they help leaders to create strategies that are not only smart on paper, but they're resilient in reality. Okay, so far we've talked about what strategic thinking is and why systems thinking is a critical foundation to strategic thinking. But now let's get practical. So what actually makes a good strategy? So Richard Rumelt, in his classic book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, gives us a simple but a really powerful framework. So he says that good strategy has 3 essential components. So the first is a clear diagnosis. You can't solve a problem that you haven't defined. Good strategy begins by honestly identifying the critical challenges facing the organization, not a vague description like we need to grow, but a clear-eyed assessment of what's actually holding growth back. So for example, is it poor customer retention? Is it slow product development time? Is it a broken supply chain? I mean, without a diagnosis, leaders end up chasing symptoms instead of solving the real issue. You need a guiding policy. So once you've diagnosed the challenge, the next step is a guiding policy that frames how the organization will actually approach it. And so this is not a detailed plan. It's a directional choice. So, for example, if the diagnosis is our costs are too high, then the guiding policy might be, well, we need to simplify our product portfolio and focus only on our most profitable lines. So the key here is clarity. The guiding policy rules out distractions and it channels energy. And then the next thing is coherent actions. So a good strategy translates that policy into a set of coordinated actions. And so this is really where the rubber meets the road. So if the policy is to simplify the product portfolio, then the coherent actions here might include discontinuing low margin products or investing in automation and training sales teams to focus on premium offerings. Each action reinforces the others. Now, strategy fails when actions are scattered, when they're inconsistent, or when they're contradictory. And Rumelt also gives us a warning. He says, bad strategy is not the absence of strategy. It's a strategy that fails to face the problem. And too often organizations fall into this trap. They produce glossy documents, they're filled with buzzwords, but they have no real diagnosis. They have no real policy. They have no coherent action. And so now, how do you know if your strategy is actually good? Well, here are some litmus tests that leaders can use. So the first is clarity. Can every manager explain the strategy in a sentence or two? If they can't, it's too vague. The next up is alignment. So do frontline employees understand how their work connects to strategy? Research from Harvard Business Review Analytics Services found that companies with clearly communicated strategies are 12 times more likely to achieve alignment and performance goals. Next up is focus. So does this strategy involve real choices? If your strategy tries to do everything, it's not a strategy. It's a wish list. Now, next up is evidence of impact. So are your coherent actions producing measurable progress towards diagnosis? If not, the strategy may be misdirected. So McKinsey actually adds another point, which is that organizations with strong alignment between strategy and execution deliver 30% higher shareholder returns than those without that alignment. Now, that's the financial payoff of a strategy that is both well-designed and well-executed. So let's bring this down to the level of the leaders in the room. So even if you're not the one writing the corporate strategy, you can apply these same principles at the team level. So a department leader can diagnose the critical challenge facing their team, they can set a guiding policy, and they can align the actions. And a frontline manager can connect their team's daily tasks to the broader diagnosis and guiding policy. That's the beauty of Rumelt's framework. It scales. So whether you're a CEO or a supervisor, a good strategy always requires the same ingredients. It requires clear diagnosis, a guiding policy, and coherent actions. And here's the punchline. When leaders at every level think this way, strategy stops being a document that's created at the top of the organization and ignored at the bottom. It becomes a living pattern of choices that runs through the entire organization. All right, so at this point, you might be thinking, okay, I get what strategic thinking is, but isn't this really just for executives? Like, why do managers or frontline leaders really need it at all? And the short answer is it's critical for them, and here's why. So first, the research is clear. Harvard Business Review has consistently ranked strategic thinking as the #1 most valued leadership skill for senior leaders. But it doesn't just stop at the top. Bain & Company found that organizations where strategic thinking is distributed across all levels of leadership are 2.5 times more likely to outperform peers in revenue growth. And strategy is not a top-down exercise. It's a collective discipline. So Henry Mintzberg, one of the giants of management thinking, he put it simply. He said, quote, "In a complex world, strategic thinking is everyone's job." So let's unpack why they say this. So #1, leaders make better decisions under uncertainty. I mean, every leader, regardless of level, faces trade-offs. Do we spend more time on this project or that one? Do we prioritize efficiency or innovation? Leaders who think strategically don't just react in the moment. They weigh decisions against the bigger picture. They understand the ripple effects of their choices and they align them with their long-term goals. Second, teams execute with greater alignment when leaders have strategic thinking. So when they can explain not just what needs to be done, but why it matters, their teams just perform better. Work becomes meaningful because it connects to a larger purpose. This connection boosts engagement. So Gallup produced the State of the Workplace report, and their latest one shows that employees who understand how their work contributes to organizational goals are 3.5 times more likely to be engaged. All right, so third, leaders build credibility with executives because executives notice when a manager can speak strategy. Leaders who connect their team's work to enterprise level goals demonstrate maturity, foresight, and readiness for bigger roles. In fact, the Center for Creative Leadership has shown that strategic thinking is one of the strongest predictors of promotion into senior leadership. Fourth up is that organizations adapt faster to change when leaders are trained on strategy. So we live in an environment that's defined by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this is what we call the VUCA or VUCA world. Now, in this context, it's not enough for a handful of executives to think strategically. Organizations need leaders at every level who can anticipate changes, recognize patterns, and adjust course. Otherwise, opportunities get missed and risks escalate before they reach the C-suite's radar. Next up is distributed strategy fuels innovation. So some of the best ideas in organizations come from the middle. Leaders who are close to the front lines often see trends emerging first. So they see shifting customer needs, new technology applications, or even just subtle cultural changes. So when those leaders are trained to think strategically, they don't just observe the problems, they frame opportunities, they test hypotheses, and they propose solutions that align with the company's intent. So put simply, without strategic thinking at every level, organizations become brittle. They rely on a small group at the top to carry all of the weight of foresight, while everyone else just executes orders. That's not resilience, that's fragility. With strategic thinking spread across the leadership bench, organizations become adaptive, innovative, and aligned. Leaders connect the dots, teams find meaning in their work, executives trust their pipeline, and the whole organization becomes more capable of turning vision into reality. So to return to the question, do all leaders need strategic thinking skills? I mean, the evidence and the risks of not having them make the answer really clear. Strategic thinking isn't just for executives, it's for anyone responsible for leading others. Because leadership without strategy, that's just activity management. All right, now we've talked about what strategic thinking is and why all leaders need it. So now let's flip that lens and ask, what happens if leaders don't develop this skill? Now, the consequences are real for individuals, for teams, and for entire organizations. So the first thing that happens is leaders stay stuck in the tactical. And when managers can't think strategically, they default to firefighting. So they spend all their energy putting out immediate flames instead of preventing the next blaze. Their calendars are full, their teams are busy, but progress feels like running on a treadmill. Tactical execution without strategic guidance is motion, but without momentum. The second thing that happens is misalignment grows. So without strategic thinking, leaders struggle to connect their team's work to organizational priorities. And so the result here is that teams execute hard, but on the wrong things. So a PwC strategy and survey found that only 28% of senior executives feel confident that middle managers understand the company's strategy. And that means nearly 3/4 of managers are steering without a map. The third thing that happens is initiative fatigue sets in. So when strategy isn't clear, organizations chase too many priorities at once. Leaders pile on initiatives without alignment. They're burning out their teams by doing this. And so employees feel like they're constantly starting but rarely finishing. And Gallup research shows that this lack of clarity is a major driver of disengagement. And disengagement costs organizations $8.8 trillion globally in lost productivity. Fourth up is that opportunities are missed. So non-strategic leaders focus narrowly on their immediate tasks. They don't zoom out to see emerging opportunities or risks. And so think about how many organizations failed to adapt quickly to a digital disruption or shifting consumer expectations, not because they lack the resources, but because their leaders weren't trained to connect the dots and act early. All right, and then fifth up, execution fails. And this is perhaps the most damning statistic. So Kaplan and Norton, in their work on the balanced scorecard, found that 67% of well-formulated strategies fail due to poor execution. And so why does execution fail? It's because people don't understand the strategy. When leaders aren't strategic, they can't translate the what into a meaningful why. And then leadership pipelines dry up. So executives look for managers who can step into bigger roles. When they see leaders who are excellent executors, but they lack strategic thinking, they lose confidence in the pipeline. That creates succession gaps. And that's a real risk in today's tight talent market. So let's make this plain. Failing to develop strategic thinking, it's not just a nice to have problem. It carries really concrete costs: wasted resources, disengaged employees, stalled innovations, and failed strategies. I mean, Donald Sull captured it well in MIT Sloan Management Review. He said, quote, "Most organizations don't fail for lack of strategy. They fail for lack of execution. And execution fails because people don't understand the strategy." And this is exactly what happens when leaders lacking strategic thinking or are lacking strategic thinking skills. Execution grinds down to a halt because no one can connect the dots. And the irony is that many organizations respond to these risks by doubling down on efficiency training or process improvements or new technology. And all of these can be valuable, but none of them address the root problem. I mean, the real fix here is equipping leaders with the ability to think and act strategically. And here's the important takeaway. These risks are not theoretical. They show up every day in misaligned projects and overworked teams, in missed market shifts, and frustrated executives. And the cost of not developing strategic thinking, I mean, it's already on your balance sheet. So the good news, it doesn't have to stay that way. All right, so at this point, we've established that strategic thinking is essential and that failing to develop it carries serious risks. But here's the question that often comes up. Can strategic thinking really be taught? Or is it something that you either have or you don't? And the good news here is that the research is really clear. Strategic thinking is totally a learnable skill. So Cynthia Montgomery of Harvard Business School makes this point directly in her book entitled The Strategist. She said, quote, "Strategic thinking is not mystical. It's a discipline that can be learned." And she's right, because strategic thinking isn't about having a crystal ball or a genius level IQ. It's about practicing a specific set of habits like systems perspective, hypothesis testing, and connecting short-term actions to long-term intent. Now, the Center for Creative Leadership has studied this extensively, and in one of their longitudinal programs, leaders who received targeted training in strategic thinking showed a 20 to 25% improvement in decision-making effectiveness compared with peers who did not. Now, that's not theory. That is measurable, quantifiable growth. And Harvard Business Review also found that 75% of leaders who received training in strategy reported being better able to align their teams to organizational goals. So in other words, once leaders understand how to think strategically, they can cascade that understanding down to their teams. Alignment improves, execution improves, and performance improves. So strategic thinking can be taught. What does that actually look like in practice? So number one, it starts with reflection. Leaders need structured opportunities to step out of the weeds and to think. Reflection isn't wasted time. It's where strategic insights emerge. But many organizations just don't create space for that. The second thing is practice. So like any other skill, strategic thinking develops through repetition. Leaders need to practice diagnosing challenges, forming guiding policies, and aligning coherent actions. The more they do it, the more natural it becomes. Third up is feedback. So leaders also need coaching and feedback. So remember Donald Sull's point, execution fails because people don't understand the strategy. So when leaders got feedback or they get feedback on how well they're connecting the dots for their teams, they sharpen their ability to do so over time. Next up is dialogue. So strategy isn't developed in isolation. Leaders learn to think strategically through conversation. through testing ideas, seeing different perspectives, and challenging assumptions. And so this is why facilitated sessions are so powerful. And here's an important myth to bust, because some people assume that strategic thinking is reserved for those with certain personality traits. They're reserved for visionaries or big picture thinkers or natural entrepreneurs. But studies show that that's really not the case. When given structured opportunities to learn, practice, and receive feedback, leaders at all levels improve significantly in their strategic capabilities. And this is why organizations that invest in strategy development programs see a tangible return. Boston Consulting Group has found that companies who intentionally develop strategy skills in their leadership ranks see, on average, 19% higher profitability than their peers. So the answer to our original question is clear. Yes, strategic thinking can be taught. It can be cultivated. It can be strengthened. And that's where firms like ours come in, because while it's teachable, it doesn't happen by accident. Leaders need intentional development experiences, structured, supported, and facilitated by people who understand the realities of leading in complex organizations. And that's where Unity & Company plays a critical role. And that's exactly where we'll turn next. All right, so we've come full circle. We've defined what strategic thinking is, we've explored its components, we've looked at the foundations of systems thinking, we've examined what makes a good strategy, and shown why it matters for every leader and not just executives. And we've also seen the risks of leaving the skill undeveloped, and we've established that strategic thinking can, in fact, be taught. Now, that brings us to the most important question, which is how do you build this capability in your leaders? And here's the reality. Most organizations struggle to do this internally. And it's not because they don't value strategy. It's because they lack a neutral space. They lack the right frameworks, and they lack the facilitation expertise needed to help leaders actually practice strategic thinking. Because too often, strategy training is reduced to a one-off workshop or a lecture on the corporate plan. And leaders leave with information, but not transformation. And that's really where Unity & Company comes in. Because first, our team is different. We're not career academics. We're not generalist trainers. Every one of our consultants has been an executive, a program leader, or a department head. And we've sat in the seats that your leaders are sitting in. We know firsthand what it means to connect the dots between vision and execution, because we've had to do it under real world pressure ourselves. And that experience matters. It means that our training is grounded in practice, not just theory. And second, we provide what we call a supportive container. So leaders don't just need content. They need a safe and responsive environment where they can wrestle with these ideas, where they can test them and apply them to their own challenges. And we facilitate conversations that draw leaders out of tactical mode and into strategic reflection. And because we're external, leaders can speak freely without worrying about how their comments will be perceived internally. That psychological safety, that's essential, and it's very difficult for companies to create for themselves. And third, we focus on applied learning. So our programs aren't about abstract case studies that don't connect to your world. We design sessions where leaders bring their real challenges into the room and work through them using proven frameworks. So whether it's Rumelt's diagnosis policy action model, whether it's Liedtka's 5 dimensions or system thinking tools, the result is that strategic thinking isn't just talked about, it's practiced. And finally, the data is on our side because research shows that companies who invest in developing strategy skills across their leadership ranks see significant gains. Boston Consulting Group found that organizations with stronger strategy capabilities deliver 19% higher profitability on average. And Harvard Business Review reports that aligned organizations where leaders at all levels understand the strategy are 12 times more likely to achieve performance goals. Now, these aren't just soft outcomes, they're hard business results. So here's the punchline. Strategic thinking is just too important to leave to chance. It's not enough to hope that your managers pick it up as they go. The risks of not developing this skill are too high, and the benefits of building it are just too great. And the best way to make it happen is with a partner who can bring both expertise and neutrality, practice and perspective. And that's exactly what we do at Unity & Company. So if you want leaders who can align their teams, anticipate challenges, seize opportunities, and drive results, leaders who don't just manage activity but shape the future, then investing in their strategic thinking is just non-negotiable. And we'd love to help you make that happen. Thanks for joining us today.